Hello, welcome to this special year-end edition of ThreatTraq. I'm Brian Rexroad. I'm joined by John Hogoboom, Matt Keyser, and John Markley. And what we'd like to do is reintroduce a few of our favorite stories from the past year. And let's go to you, John Hogoboom, first. And what do you find to be your particular favorite?
Thanks, Brian. So, it's no secret that if you've been watching the show, one of the security threats that concerns me most are advanced persistent threats. We touch on it a lot on the show off and on when it comes up. And it's one of those areas that I'm particularly concerned about because it really has been affecting our economy and the strength of businesses in the United States and how well they are able to compete. In any event, one of the stories that around this subject that really was encouraging to me is back early in February, the president issued an executive order on cybersecurity to increase the sharing that the government can do with the private sector. And right after that, like literally a week after that was signed, I think, the FBI released a joint indicator bulletin with lots of APT indicators in there, as well as Mandiant, who's a private sector company that's pretty well known for fighting advanced persistent threats. They also released their APT-1 report with tons and tons of indicators, all kinds of useful information. It was almost a challenge for a lot of people who might not have seen that kind of information before to figure out how do I use all this and leverage it in my particular security defense areas, and how would I best leverage it. Anyway, the crux of what I'm pleased about is that we now have some baseline of government sharing with private sector, as well as private sector industry sharing with each other. So I kind of, looking back, there was a lot of talk of indicators of compromise. I almost consider this to be the indicator of compromise year, where everybody was getting lots of indicators, and we're trying to figure out how to share ones that we have with other partners and have those partners share with each other. There's been a lot of movement in this space over the past year. So you have all these frameworks that have been coming up, such as STIX, the Structured Threat Information Exchange format. Mandiant has their Open IOC format. The IETF has their IODEF format. So they're all kind of doing similar things, but trying to come up with a common language that we can all use to share indicator information with each other. And then there's also been some companies that have kind of sprung up to address some of this type of information. So you have Looking Glass. Threat Connect is another one that's kind of emerged, and there's probably a few other players in this space of kind of centralized portals where people can share indicators with each other and have kind of a common community type of experience for doing so. So I'm encouraged by that. That's kind of my story of that I was pleased to see, and that I hope we see more of, going into 2014 and onward. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good, John. That's I think that activity, the sharing from the government, as well as you mentioned a number of commercial developments along those lines, is continuing to develop and mature, and definitely the right path to be going. Certainly, we've recognized in the past that the attackers are sharing information and ways to perform attacks. They're becoming more organized and certain specialized in particular areas of activity, and so the response areas have to be equally as capable and agile. Very good. John Markley, do you have a favorite story for the year?
There's several, but I know the one that kind of sticks in my head the most has not only a personal nature to it, just from a historical perspective, but also more of a long-term issue, and that is back in August of this year, I think August 27th was the episode date. I covered a Bitcoin issue, in particular with apps on the Android Play market, where there was a report that the apps doing Bitcoin transactions could actually, be hijacked, and you could steal a certain small amount of dollars. It wasn't a lot, but it was. And there's some differing amounts on that. What makes this story, I think, kind of interesting to me is first off, we have Bitcoins, which is certainly this year seemed to take off on stories about use of and hijacks of and and unfortunately theft of, those have becoming more and more prevalent.
Mm-hmm.
We also have issues with this kind of concern that financial transactions over the internet, whatever we use, might be subject to these kinds of hijacks. But it's that kind of interest that that sparks me to consider this as a long-term story. On a personal note, the thing I remember is, and a lot of us were programmers at one time. If you recall, when you do random number generation, which is where this flaw was, you always seed that random number. You always want to create a seed, and that was the whole problem here. They didn't seed it. The base program didn't have an automatic seed, a requirement for it. So they were leaving that as a null, which means that it really never was random. And I think that's the story here is that computers don't do random numbers. There's no such thing as a random number. That's why they're called pseudo-random. And if we don't help it out, and until we get to quantum computers and some kind of a real randomness in them, we have to recognize that that it's not truly random, and that there could be some guesswork out there that could compromise things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of these sorts of attacks, that is, guessing against randomization, has been largely a theoretical attack in the past.
Yeah.
As we raise the stakes, as these sorts of transactions are associated with more monetary value, then the stakes get higher, and that gives an opportunity for, or more motivation for attackers to try to find a way around it. They're willing to spend more capability in terms of processing to help thwart those protection mechanisms. So I think you have a very good theme there, John, in the sense that we need to be paying attention to the fact that, as like I said, as the stakes get higher, the motivation to crack also becomes higher. And along the lines of cracking, I guess, Matt, do you have a favorite story for the year?
I do. This is actually one that Jim covered, I believe, on June 4th of this year. Ars Technica, one of my favorite news sources, did a really excellent series of articles about password cracking, about the technology behind it, the techniques, and they went into a lot of really good detail. And what I liked about this story the most is that it shows that the thoughts that we've had ever since we started using passwords in computing, which is, we've used it forever now, but everyone thinks they know how to create a good password. And, instead of using a single word, use phrases and add numbers and add symbols. But it turns out there's very predictable ways that people write passwords all the time, and password crackers are smart enough to understand that and write their tools in a way to use these same exact passwords. So if someone tells you, for example, you've got to have a password that has six letters, lowercase, uppercase, and numbers, and at least one symbol, most people will go ahead, capitalize the first letter, keep the rest of the word lowercase, and then tag a number and a symbol at the end. And that's one of the most popular patterns, and most cracking tools will automatically use that now. So, people think that they know how to make a really good password, but it turns out it's not as easy as all that. And not only that, is that in the last year or so, we've had such a number of password breaches where the entire lists have been, out in the open. Password crackers are taking these lists and using them to feed back into their cracking efforts. I mean, the original huge password breach was the RockU database, and passwords from that list are still being used today. I mean, even this past week, we saw there was a huge release related to the Pony, a particular Pony loader botnet, and that list has, shows that people are still using the same exact terrible passwords, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and things like that. And this really resonates with me because I know lots of people who use, people who are friends of mine who aren't technically literate and still, have to use computers and have to set up their own security in form of these passwords. I'd like to move on from this, but I realize it's not as simple a problem as that. We've got two-factor authentication. We've got other technologies that should help us get past passwords and find something more secure where the human being isn't the weakest link in the entire operation, but it seems that we're stuck there, and that's why this story means so much to me.
So I'd like to share one of my favorite stories from the year, and this one is related to the Karna botnet, and we reported on the Karna botnet on March 19th in 2013, and this was one that was associated with the Internet Census 2012, and this was actually a census that was created around a that used a botnet that was effectively created through malicious means, that is compromising many hundreds of thousands of devices around the internet to conduct this. And it is one that we had been reporting way back into April of 2012. And so we were tracking the activity associated with this botnet. To our knowledge, we did not find any other sources that were aware of this botnet at the time as we were tracking it. We were trying to, at the time, figure out a way to start notifying organizations about this particular issue so that they could repair the situation. But clearly this was a case where embedded devices were associated with this botnet, that is, embedded software associated with many different types of devices. We most significantly saw it as security surveillance camera DVRs. And as we were tracking this, trying to find a way to remediate the problem, our observations were, there really isn't a patching process associated with these devices. They don't run antivirus. They're generally actually deliberately opened up to be accessible from the internet, and they're on all the time. So these types of devices, as they become more prolific, are going to become more of a concern. And John Hogoboom, I guess you had perhaps some other thoughts around this as well.
Well, yeah, this is kind of a common theme, not necessarily this particular botnet, but the types of devices that were compromised was a common theme throughout this year, I think. We had stories about other security camera DVR-based botnets, one of them being the Light Hydra. I think we touched on that last week quickly, just mentioning it. But that compromises home routers and security camera DVRs as well. The D-Link compromise that we had talked about on your home router, where there's a backdoor user agent that you could put in. There were some Jet Direct vulnerabilities, another type of embedded device. All these. And then the other one actually we talked about last week, not necessarily an embedded device, but the Asterisk PBX for your voice over IP. That's the kind of a device that you kind of drop it in and you might not really look at what's happening on it because it's handling phone calls and whatnot. And I think it's important with these embedded devices and these other devices like that, that you might not have, we're all pretty aware of what's going on our desktop when something's messed up or you might have malware on it because you use it all the time and you're interacting with it. But some of these other things, embedded devices and appliances and whatnot, you might not have quite as much insight into if it's been compromised or not, especially these embedded stuff like home routers that are at the perimeter of your network where you might not even see any weird network traffic. It's at the very edge of your enterprise or whatnot. So, it's an important thing to keep on top of and to patch, which is also a problem that you mentioned. There's not a good patching process for these devices in general, and hopefully maybe we'll get there at some point in the industry where it'll be as well defined as operating systems are for applying patches.
And that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at threattrack@list.att.com, and you can also find us on Twitter at ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel. It's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. You can subscribe to an audio-only version of the ThreatTraq program on iTunes as well. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John. Thank you, Matt. And thank you, John Markley. It is John Hogoboom and John Markley. I'm Brian Rexroad, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.